NASCAR's West Coast swing ran through Phoenix today, and Kyle Busch is now one step closer to making history. How's it going, you guys? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove. Before I get today's episode started, I want to wish a very happy birthday to someone very close, someone very personal to me, who I've never met actually before, or at least never said any meaningful words to before. Happy birthday, Matt Kenseth, 47 years old. You know, that's kind of old, I guess. I'm not going to lie to you and say that you're like super young. If you're young, you wouldn't have lost your ride to Eric Jones. But needless to say, happy birthday, Matt Kenseth. Let's go on with the show. I just got done watching the Ticket Guardian 500 at ISM Raceway, Phoenix. I still kind of call it Phoenix. I mean, they reconfigured it, spent a lot of money, made it look all nice. I need to go to a race there now. It seems like it's amazing. But yeah, ISM Raceway, race is complete. Kyle Busch is your winner. His 52nd career Cup Series win, but his 199th win in all of NASCAR National Series. He swept the weekend yet again, winning the Xfinity race yesterday, his 94th Xfinity win, and then of course won the Cup race today. But it wasn't easy. He kind of dominated the race, at least that's how it felt, but for a race that was largely dominated by Kyle Busch, there were a lot of moving pieces. So we're going to talk about some of the major takeaways I had from watching today's race. I'm going to look at some of the top finishers and point out ones that I think are notable. Let's get to it, talking about ISM. I want to start by talking about Kyle Busch a little bit. Like I said at the very top of the show, he is one step closer now to making NASCAR history. Richard Petty, the king, the quote-unquote greatest NASCAR driver of all time, 200 career Cup Series wins. I mentioned a second ago, Kyle Busch now has 199 wins, all across the Xfinity Truck and Cup Series. All throughout the NASCAR world the last couple of weeks, people have been debating whose record is more impressive, Kyle Busch's or Richard Petty's. Now the big difference is that Kyle Busch has gotten a lot of his wins going down to the lower series like the Trucks and Xfinity Series, whereas Richard Petty got all of his wins in the Cup Series. So by that logic, there really shouldn't be a debate. Richard Petty's more impressive. But the big difference is that back in the day, decades ago when Richard Petty was driving, there really weren't that many competitive cars. There were sometimes more races, shorter races. Racing in general just looked completely different. The cars were completely different than they are today. It was really a different sport back when Richard Petty was racking up wins. Kyle Busch has raced arguably in the most competitive era in NASCAR. His whole Cup Series career has taken place during Jimmy Johnson's 7-time championship reign. So Kyle Busch has arguably had a lot more competition than Richard Petty did. But then Kyle Busch does go down to the Trucks and Xfinity Series where he usually is the best driver there, and at that point the competition level is definitely lowered. So that's why there's a debate. Is Kyle Busch's record more impressive or is Richard Petty's more impressive? I'm in the group where I just don't really think you can compare the two. In my opinion, you can really divide NASCAR up into different eras. Richard Petty was the best ever during his era, but then the sport changed quite a bit, and I would say Dale Earnhardt in the 80s and early 90s was the greatest in the sport, and then pretty quickly when Jeff Gordon came onto the scene, I think you could argue he was the greatest at one point, and then since basically 2005 really, Jimmy Johnson I think has unarguably, without argument, has been the best driver in NASCAR. The last couple of years with Jimmy Johnson starting to get older, you could argue maybe that Kyle Busch is transitioning into the greatest of this new era, but that's still up in the air. It's still early to say that. Richard Petty's the greatest of his era, and no driver is ever going to match his 200 career Cup Series win record. That's impossible. Kyle Busch right now is probably the closest we're going to see to that. Remember, Kyle Busch is only 33 years old, and he's already got 52 Cup Series wins. That puts him 11th on the all-time NASCAR wins list when we're just talking about Cup Series. We can go down and talk about how he's the all-time winningest truck driver, all-time winningest Xfinity driver, and it's not even close. But when we even just look at the Cup Series, Kyle Busch is already arguably a top 10 driver all-time statistically. And with him being only 33 years old, the sky really is the limit. Could he reach Jimmy Johnson's record, currently of 83 wins? Could he break up into the top 5? Could he get past Jeff Gordon? Could he even possibly reach David Pearson up there with north of 100 wins? Could we see Kyle Busch hit that at some point? I don't think it's impossible. Over the last couple of years, Kyle Busch has made the case that he is the new best driver of this era, and we'll see if he can continue this type of dominance for 5, 10 more years. Yeah, I think we'll be talking about Kyle Busch in the same breath as Jimmy Johnson, as Dale Earnhardt, as Richard Petty, but I'm not quite sure he's there yet. That being said, the fact that he's about to hit 200 career wins across all of NASCAR, he'll probably do it next week sometime, that's still very, very impressive, and it deserves to be celebrated. There's going to be haters out there all the time, but Kyle Busch deserves to be respected, or celebrated at least, for this incredible milestone. You just don't see anybody else doing this. I made a whole video talking about Kyle Busch and his records. Go check it out. I uploaded a couple weeks ago. You can check that out if you want to hear me go more in depth about some of Kyle Busch's Xfinity Truck and Cup Series statistics and where he stacks up all time. I'd be curious to know what you guys think about Kyle Busch. I know he's a very polarizing driver, but if we try to look at him objectively, without any sort of, off-the-track bias, it's hard not to say that he's a top 10 driver of all time right now, and he has the opportunity to be said, a top 5 driver, a Mount Rushmore driver in NASCAR history. He's got a chance. Talking about this race at ISM, however, let's look at the top 20 finishing results from this race. Joe Gibbs Racing gets their second win of the season. So 4 races in, Gibbs has 2 victories, and Penske has 2 victories. Those 2 teams have clearly separated themselves as the best teams in the NASCAR Cup Series right now. And you see Gibbs and Penske, top 3 right there. Ryan Blaney's teammates had won the last 2 races at Las Vegas and Atlanta. It looked for a little while here that this was Ryan Blaney's week to kind of break into the win category for Penske, but he started on the pole, led some laps early on, and thanks to some pit strategy, taking only 2 tires on the final restart or the final pit stops of this race, he was able to take the lead and held onto it for quite a while until Kyle Busch was able to pass him with 15 to go. Still very impressive for Ryan Blaney. I've talked about it the last couple weeks, he's looked a little off from his teammates Logano and Keselowski, but today, Blaney definitely carried the banner for Team Penske, so that was good to see, very impressive. Looks like he could win some races this year. Now, Martin Truex Jr. ended up finishing this race in second. He was a rocket ship there in the final 30, 40 laps or so. With Kyle Busch, Ryan Blaney battling, kind of saving some fuel. Martin Truex Jr. was just carving through the field. I think he was 8 seconds behind the lead with about 35 laps to go. 8 seconds, and he ended up only losing by about 1 second. So he made up 7 seconds in about 30 laps. That was insane. If this race goes on another 4 or 5 laps, Martin Truex Jr. wins this thing easily. This reminds me a lot of Atlanta, where once again it was Martin Truex Jr. closing in on the lead late, but just ended up a few laps short. Martin Truex Jr. and that team, they got the long run speed. They're going to have to work on that short run speed perhaps if they really want to start winning races with Joe Gibbs Racing. But that team doesn't seem to have missed a beat at all. Cole Pearn and Martin Truex Jr. have transitioned from Furniture Row over to JGR, and they look to be just as good as any of the guys on that team. They look like they're the second best car. Gibbs right now behind Kyle Busch, and I think that's about where they want to be right now. Well, they want to be best, I guess, but that's about where I think we expected them to be. I think expectations right now, they're meeting them so far. Eric Almirola played the strategy well. Another solid top 5 finish for him. Good start to the season. Denny Hamlin as well, continuing to back up that Daytona 500 win with some solid performances. Looking good. Like I said, JGR, Joe Gibbs Racing, looks outstanding right now, and Denny Hamlin's taking advantage of it. I want to talk a little bit about those Chip Ganassi racing cars. They're finishing 6th and 7th. Kurt Busch had top 5s at both Atlanta and Las Vegas. I figured, he's got to slow down at some point. They're not going to keep finishing in the top 5. He's not going to keep running that well. We come here to ISM, 7th place finish. It just goes to show you what happens when you put a talented past champion in a struggling race car. He's going to make that car look outstanding. We saw it happen with Roush when they put Matt Kenseth in the 6th last year. He was winning stages and running in the top 10 at the end of that year. You put Kurt Busch in a team that car didn't even make the playoffs last year. One car didn't even make the playoffs last year, and Kurt Busch is a 3rd place, a 5th place, and a 7th place the last 3 weeks. That's insane. Kudos to them. He's made that entire team better because you see Kyle Larson there in 6th as well. Remember, Kyle Larson led a lot of laps at Atlanta. So Chip Ganassi Racing looks like the best Chevy team right now. We'll talk more about that later on, but strong performance once again for those 2 guys. I'll talk about Jimmy Johnson here in just a second, but Kevin Harvick, you see there finishing 9th. This is the same guy that has 9 wins at ISM Raceway. I think a lot of people thought he would run better than this. I predicted, though, on the NASCAR Weekly podcast earlier this week that he would run 8th to 10th, and that's where I thought he would finish. Sure enough, finished 9th, so I nailed that prediction. Kevin Harvick's team, they look good this year, but Stewart-Haas Racing looks to be a step worse than they were last year. That's why I made that prediction. Penske looks great. They're the best Ford team right now. Joe Gibbs Racing looks great. They're the best Toyota team, maybe the best team overall right now. Stewart-Haas Racing, slight notch down. That's why I didn't think Kevin Harvick would look as good. I didn't think he'd win this race. I didn't think he'd contend for the win. And sure enough, he was up in the top 5 here and there, but most of the race he spent around 6th to 10th place, and that's where he finished. So I don't know. Stewart-Haas Racing might have a small step to take before they can become a championship contender again. Joey Logano finishing 10th. Penske, like I said, solid day. Brad Keselowski had a tire issue early on, or actually a track bar, sway bar issue on that car, so that's why he did not have a good finish. But okay day, I guess, for Penske. You got a 3rd place and a 10th place finish. I want to talk about Roush Fenway right there. Roush Fenway Racing's made some gains this year early on. Both of their guys with top 15 finishes. Ryan Newman ran in the top 5 and the top 10 almost all day long. It's not the first race he's done that this year. I think Atlanta, he had a top 10 run for most of the race. Faded a little bit later on. Late race, long run seemed to kind of do him in a little bit, but definitely some positive strides for Roush Fenway. 15th through 18th, there's some attaboys. Ty Dillon, top 15, very, very impressive. Daniel Hemrick down there, a rookie. Ryan Preece had some issues. He wrecked on a restart later in this race in stage 3. So the rookie battle right now is pretty heavily swung in Daniel Hemrick's direction. He's impressed me actually so far. Richard Childress Racing looks a little better this year than last year, which isn't too surprising. But I didn't expect Daniel Hemrick to be outrunning Austin Dillon from time to time. Now, Austin Dillon had a better car. He ran out of fuel late in this race. That's the only reason he's not in this top 20. So Austin Dillon outran Daniel Hemrick. But Daniel Hemrick looks solid. Look overall solid. Like, if he can get top 20s consistently early in the season, once he gets some experience, by the end of the year, we might see him competing for top 10s more often. So impressive for Daniel Hemrick. Chris Buescher there as well. Matt Tifft finishing 20th. another rookie. That's impressive too, especially given that team didn't exist last year. So that's pretty cool. Now I skipped over the Hendrick cars at first, but I'm going to talk about them now because I love talking about Hendrick Motorsports. A hot topic of conversation these days. But don't worry, it's not all bad things to say today. I mean, sure, when you look at that, where's William Byron? Where's Alex Bowman? Why are they not even in the top 20? Why is Chase Elliott outside the top 10? Like, that's kind of disappointing if you're a Hendrick fan, especially if you're a longtime Hendrick fan. But that being said, there are still some good things to come out of today's race. Number one, Jimmie Johnson, the guy who's supposed to be the leader of this team, finally looked like the leader of this team for the first time all year. Ran top 10, even top 5, took the lead thanks to some pitch strategy, but didn't hold on to it for very long. In fact, couldn't even hold on to it for a straightaway, so still not great there. But Jimmie Johnson, ran top 5, looked fairly competitive, and got himself a solid top 10 finish. So Jimmie Johnson was the best Hendrick car today, and honestly wasn't too bad. I don't think he ever showed winning speed, but he looked like a guy who, if things went his way, could finish in the top 5, and that's a pretty big step forward, given that Jimmie Johnson's had 25th place cars 2 weeks in a row. So overall, if you're a Hendrick fan and you see Jimmie Johnson, once again leading that team and running really well, that's got to be a positive sign. If Jimmie Johnson, the 7-time champion, can run well in those cars, at some point you'd hope that would trickle down to Elliott, Byron, Bowman. Now there are still a lot of negatives, because at the end of the day, no top 5, no cars in the top 5 for Hendrick Motorsports, only 2 cars in the top 20. That's not Hendrick Motorsports, so they still have a lot of ways to go. Alex Bowman, the hometown guy, he's from Arizona, ran really well here. Remember back in 2016 when he was subbing for Dale Earnhardt Jr., this has kind of become one of his best tracks. He finished 35th. He had some tire issues, got caught up in a couple wrecks, or basically had 2 tires cut down on him, wrecked twice. That's why he didn't finish very well. He wasn't running that great before that happened. I know he started up there near the top 5, ran there for a little bit in stage 1, but once he fell back in traffic, could really not do anything, so kind of a disappointing effort from him. William Byron, basically the same exact story. Was up there in the top 5 early on, but pretty quick started to fade outside the top 10, outside the top 15, and once that happened, really could never make that ground back up. So those 2 teams still have kind of ways to go. They got a lot of catching up to do. Chase Elliott flirted around 8th to 15th, sometimes 20th all day long. Definitely, you expect more from a guy who won 3 races last year, but still, not horrible. Again, maybe a small step forward for Hendrick this weekend, mainly because Jimmie Johnson finally looked kind of like Jimmie Johnson again. That's all I can really say about Hendrick Motorsports. They didn't wow me this weekend, but at least they didn't struggle quite as bad as maybe they have the last few weeks. They look like maybe they've stabilized for the time being, and maybe they can start to get better. If you want to hear me talk more about my thoughts on Hendrick Motorsports and their recent decline, you can check out my video from just a couple days ago. Talk all about Hendrick. Before we wrap up this episode, you guys thought I forgot about it, we gotta do the Groovy Gauge. What kind of racing do we see at ISM? How good was the race as a whole from an entertainment perspective? We gotta rate this thing. Cars had 750 horsepower again today, so engines were basically the same as last year. We still had the big rear spoiler and the aero ducts to help cool the brakes, so a couple small changes from what we saw last year, but ultimately the racing looked about the same. Restarts were insane. 5 wide almost consistently. Contact here and there. Not a lot of wrecks, a few little spins, some tire issues resulting in some of them, but great racing all around. Not a lot of carnage, but some great, just restarts in general were fantastic. The back and forth we saw, some tire strategy that worked for some, didn't work for others. That whole aspect of this race was outstanding. However, I will say the problem with Phoenix, and I don't think this is really an aero problem, I don't think there's a lot that NASCAR can do to these cars to fix that, is Phoenix is just such a flat racetrack, and as a result, it can be very hard to pass, especially when the cars would start to get strung out as a run went deeper and deeper. You couldn't really run the guy down and pass him easily. Late in the race, I saw Kevin Harvick was coming from the back, he was making some passes, Martin Truex Jr. was making some passes, but besides those guys, you didn't see a lot of people moving their way through the field very easily. It was very hard to pass. I don't think it was because of the aero package. I mean, maybe the taller rear spoiler had a little bit to do with it, but this race, like I said, looked pretty similar to past ISM Phoenix races. It's the only problem with flat tracks. It's the reason fans aren't super thrilled with New Hampshire. It's another mile-long track that's even flatter than Phoenix, and a lot of people don't always love the racing there. It's just kind of hard to pass when the track's got very little banking. But that being said, the restarts were fantastic today. Lots of movers and shakers throughout the running order, mainly thanks to those restarts. And then Kyle Busch. He dominated this race in a way, but it didn't feel like your typical Kyle Busch domination race. When Kyle Busch dominates, NASCAR fans, NASCAR Nation usually isn't too thrilled. I feel like people were having a pretty good time watching this race. I know I was. So despite the fact that Kyle Busch led the most laps, he had to work for this win. And a late race pass with 15 to go, threat of fuel mileage possibly coming into play was very interesting. This race was decent. It was above average in my opinion. I'm going to give the Ticket Guardian 500 at ISM Raceway a solid 75% on the Groovy Gauge. This first 4 races this season, we haven't really had any just amazing races where I'd say, dang, that's an all-timer. Gonna go back and watch that one years from now. But we've had consistently above average racing. The Daytona 500 was pretty good. Atlanta was pretty good. At Las Vegas was kind of weird, but it was still pretty good. Phoenix, ISM Raceway here, kind of the same thing. I will say this is probably the most predictable race we've had so far. Like, I think everyone kind of knew what we'd expect, knew what we'd see going in. I think a lot of people knew who the contenders would be, and that's ultimately what happened. But there was still some good bit of drama, some little bit of unexpectedness trickled in there, and then the racing, specifically on restarts, was outstanding. So I'm going to give this race a solid 75%. Stands looked full, infield looked packed, looked like a pretty fun crowd over there at ISM Raceway. It looks like those renovations are doing the trick. But that's all I got for today's episode, everyone. Thank you for watching. Remember, you can follow me on Instagram, you can follow me on Twitter, continue the conversation over there. You can get yourself an Out of the Groove t-shirt. If you want to support the show, check those out down by the description. Also down there, you can find the address to my P.O. box. If you want to send me some cool NASCAR stuff, I'll show it off and shout you out in an upcoming episode. And then, of course, a big, big thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters. Michael Harrison at GWizofTheStars, SelfishGifts.com, Mentally Defective, Cameron James, Jason R. Long, Wesley Donaldson, Isaac Dennison, Mika Suzuki, iFantasyRace.com, John Koblenz, Tim Shingen, and Adam Lean, and the rest of these amazing Patreon supporters. Thank you all so much for the continued support. I love to see new names up there. Really, really thank you guys for supporting the show and supporting what we're doing over here. Thank you, everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed today's race. Next week is Auto Club. We'll see the lower horsepower, higher downforce again, and could be very interesting with the huge wide, straightaways and turns and all that. We might see 7 wide. That should be. I should put a poll out on Twitter or something like that. Like, what's the most cars you think we're gonna see lined up next week? You think we'll see 6 wide? You think we'll see 7 wide? I wouldn't put it past these guys. Could be wild next week. I don't want to overhype it. Probably gonna look like your typical Auto Club race, but I don't know. I like to get excited for things way in advance. It's a blessing and also a curse sometimes. But thanks everyone for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I'll see you guys again later this week with some more uploads. Till then, bye guys.